Hi, everyone. I wanted to take just a few minutes to talk to you about the reading for this week and sort of why I'm assigning the reading this week. It relates to our disciplinary reading presentation, that assignment that is our big assignment for this module. And so, in conjunction with last week's reading, I believe this can really help you sort of set you on the right path in terms of considerations that you need to keep in mind as you develop that project, that assignment. So, and next week is when I'll give you sort of the time and the focus your energy and your attention on that assignment. But I want you to be thinking ahead always, in terms of why are we talking about this? Yes, this is a unit all about disciplinary reading. So text complexity has to be a consideration. Text complexity has to come into it. But I've talked about text complexity in the past in this course, and I tend to keep to the easily quantifiable elements. So we tend to talk about text complexity in terms of Lexile. So you can look up a book, or you can input a text, segment of text into a computer program, and it'll tell you what the Lexile is. And this, I'm not saying that these elements aren't important, that these things aren't important. We do need to consider these things, but there's so much more to it. And so I called upon this book that I really like. If I can get my slide to change here. So this is another textbook that I really enjoy. It's Fisher, Frey, and Lapp, but these are big names in disciplinary reading and just reading in general. And we're reading the first chapter, which is called Text Complexity in a New Light. And the whole text is called Text Complexity, Stretching Readers with Texts and Tasks. So I wanted to give you that citation in case you're very interested, intrigued, you want to read more. Wonderful. But basically, it tells us when we're thinking about text complexity, we need to keep three elements in mind. So we need to keep in mind the reader, the text, and the activity. We need to give sort of equal or a lot of attention to all three of these elements. And then always, because we know as culturally responsive teachers, culturally responsive practitioners, we always need to keep in mind the context and our students' sociocultural realities. We know this ties us back to the HIT grid and just kind of what you know in general about culturally responsive teaching and learning. So these are all elements to keep in mind as we think about um, what text should I give my kids, because we know if we want students to read every day and we're in physical education class or we're in music class, we're not necessarily going to have a textbook. And even if we do, that shouldn't necessarily, as you recall from last week, be the go-to in what segments you give them to read, what text you give them to read. So you want to kind of switch that up a little bit. But when we want to think about what texts we need to think about different aspects of the text. So if we start with the text, we come across a text that we really love and we want to share with our students. We might think, well, can my students handle this text? The answer to whether your students can handle a text, it's not going to be only on the page. Okay, you can't find everything you're looking for by just looking at the text, but you can find some things that you're looking for, right? So there are quantitative elements, like I told you, when they figure the Lexile. I think they look at how long the sentences are, what's the level of vocabulary, the diction that's used, the sort of the syntax and the syntactical structures that are used for the sentences, and determine that way the sort of difficulty of the text. But there are also qualitative elements that are going to sort of mediate how readable a text is for your students, and that might be the topic. What is it about? How well does it relate to them? What is the voice? Um, is it conversational? What kind of pronouns do they use? Those kind of elements are things to think about as well. So this chapter does a great job of sort of walking you through some of the textual elements that you want to keep in mind when you determine on what you're going to share with your students. You need to keep in mind the reader. Always, of course, we start with our students. We're student-centered. But thinking about our students, we think not only what are they capable of. I think I might have already told you all a teacher who I loved when I was in fourth grade. I wanted to read Sounder because the book seemed really interesting. She had done a book talk and told us what it was about. I wanted to read it. And I remember her taking it out of my hands and saying, no, that's too easy for you. And she gave it to another kid, right? I mean, he heard her too, that's too easy for you, Leah. And then she gave me Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. To this day, it's one of my favorite books. I love it. I love you, Miss Welch. Thank you for giving me that book. But I remember thinking, I later read Sounder when I was in an adolescent lit class, and I was like, oh, I always wanted to read that. They never let me read it because it was too easy. Well, that's not an easy book. I mean, the topics, the themes in that book, whew, okay. So cognitive capabilities of your students, yes, but also motivation. They want to read it. Are they going to be interested? How much background experience and knowledge do they have? What are their own experiences that they're bringing to the table? So these are all things to keep in mind when you talk about, or when you think about the reader. Now, once you've thought about the reader and the text, or the text and the reader, in whichever order, and your textbook or this chapter is going to give you some ideas about which path to take. What do we think about first and why? But once you've thought about those two elements, you need to think, okay, what are the gaps? Okay, what is my student going to need to know, and how am I going to get them there? Okay, so maybe the student doesn't have enough background interest, so I'm going to need, or background information. So I'm going to need to work that in to the activity. I'm going to need to work that into the task. How are you going to bridge those gaps? So those are the things that you want to be thinking about as you design the task. Okay, so the number one consideration of the task, according to Fisher Frey and Lab here, or the main consideration is, in whose company will the task be completed? So when you're reading this section of the chapter, if you're anything like me, Vygotsky is going to be whispering to you from the great beyond, as he does so frequently with all of us. And he's going to be like, who's the more knowledgeable other, right? And you're going to be like, Lem, I got it. It's cool. But the task is where you determine, is this something that I'm going to drive, that I'm going to model, that I'm going to show students how to do? So in the past, when I taught this class, it was always this reading assignment, disciplinary reading assignment was always a modeled reading. So I would have students pick a text from their field, a challenging text, and I would have them do a read aloud, think aloud. And this is something you can do. If this is what you want to do, this is absolutely something you can do for this assignment. But I would have each student sort of walk us through, how do you read this text as a scientist, as a mathematician, as a historian? How do you read this text, and what are your thought processes? And actually spell them out and model them for students before you have them try to read that in the same way. Ask the same kind of questions that you ask, make the same kind of connections to the extent that they're able. But that's a very challenging text, right? A lot of gaps in between where the student is now and where the text is. So that task is very sort of teacher driven, in the sense of, you have to be an expert, because an expert is necessary for this task. If the sort of text and reader are closer, and there's not such a wide gap, you might choose something that the students could complete together, right? So it could be a collaborative project, and it could be something that that you would have students collaborate on. If there's not as much distance even than that, then it's something that maybe students could complete on their own. Or maybe you're differentiating for a certain group of students who have a smaller gap than maybe the rest of your students who are doing something else. So you need to think about, go back to that gap analysis and figure out what it is that you're trying to do to bring that reader and that text together. And that's how you design your task, okay? Your assignment, your activity, whatever that may be. And then another thing that I want to draw your attention to in terms of this chapter is their discussion of productive struggle, because I just think it's really useful and really helpful. We know that in reading, when we want students to read, our goal is automaticity, because that's how we understand, when we're reading without having to consciously think about it. When we're sort of predicting the ends of sentences, and yes, we see the words there, but we we process so quickly that we're not even conscious of it. That's automaticity, right? And that's our goal in being good readers in any discipline, right? And it's more challenging in disciplinary literacies because we're a lot of times we're reading things that are um, more challenging in terms of background knowledge and experiences and things like that. And so we offer strategies, but what the readers or what the writers of this chapter point out, and I think is really important, is that in order for those strategies to become skills and to contribute to automaticity and to allow us to do these things naturally, what we need is practice. Okay, what a reader needs is practice using those strategies so that they become things that they naturally do without having to think about it, without having to consciously set it aside. So those questions that we ask ourselves as we read, that we have to stop ourselves and kind of point it out and model it for students, because we don't do it as consciously anymore. They're just things that we naturally do. So we want the strategies that we help students adapt to our disciplines and use for our disciplines. We want those to become skills. And in order to do that, they have to be reading things, even in the small gaps. There still need to be some gaps, right? We need to be challenging them somewhat, because if there's no sort of difficulty to it, then they don't have to attend to it as closely at all, right? And so they're not sort of building that capacity and building that strength. So these are some of the more important points from the text that I want you to pay attention to. And as you're reading, and or if you've already read your first go back through and look at those again, because I want you to think about each of those. I think on the very last page of this chapter that I've given you, there are these different pathways that you can consider, and it's a really cool little table that they give you, and something that I want you to be thinking about as we look forward to the end of this unit and to the disciplinary reading assignment that you're going to create and give to us, or at least to a small group of us in this class. I want you to be thinking about those pathways and how am I going to decide? Is it because I have a text that I love? Is it because that I have knowledge that I need my students to get, or for whatever reason, for whatever other reason. So think about those things and be looking forward as you read this, and trying to tie it back to the ideas that we gave you last week in terms of ways to get students reading in every discipline every day. And think about how we can turn this into something useful and practicable that you'll be able to take with you into your own classroom. Okay, so thank you so much, and I will see you again soon.